In session 1, we examine the characteristics of the diversity leader. We also use most of the session to engage in self-reflection, understanding who we are as individuals and who we are as diversity leaders and change agents. In session 2, we moved our focus to looking at power and privilege at work within our learning communities. We again engage in reflection and self-examination as an ongoing process. In this final part, we will engage in a general overview of advocacy and the need for social justice in education. Who is an advocate? How do we advocate? Why do we advocate? What are the relationships between the diversity leader, concepts of inclusion, and the advocate leader? We will examine the 3 levels: self-advocacy, individual advocacy, and systematic advocacy. Self-advocacy means speaking up and speaking out for your own rights. Self-advocates speak up for themselves. They speak up for others. They ask for support when they need it. They make sure they have a say in decisions that affect them. They ask questions and learn new skills. How do you take action for yourself? What situations around you need self-advocacy? Do you have the courage and persistence to advocate for yourself? When asked about self-advocacy, one student noted, "Yes, I live in an area where there was no water. Accessing water for everyday use was difficult. I advocated for my rights and myself by calling and writing numerous letters to the minister in charge, to the Water and Sewage Authority, and through protest actions." Individual advocacy. It takes courage and persistence to stand up for ourselves. It takes even more courage and persistence to advocate for others. When asked to describe an advocate, many of you use words such as supportive, intercessor, fighter, activist, selfless, strong-willed, spokesperson, crusader, promoter. Yes, advocating on the behalf of others will take courage, persistence, and boldness. This takes us now to systematic advocacy. When asked about advocacy in your own country, many of you list groups such as the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, Womantra, J-Flag, Coalition Advocating for Inclusion of Sexual Orientation, Women's Crisis Center, the Blind Association Council, Kids in Need of Direction. Why are these groups formed? Who are advocating for these groups? What are these groups advocating for? Or who are these groups advocating for? How do they advocate? What is the advocacy work looking like in these groups? What is the process? What do they do? These are things we need to examine as we get into the work of advocacy. I hope by now we understand the need for advocacy in education, the need for diversity leadership, the need for us to be more inclusive, that there is work to be done in the region and in the world where diversity leadership is concerned, advocacy and inclusive practices. Why do we need social justice advocacy in education? There are contradictions in our education systems. That's for number 1. There are challenges yet to overcome by many underrepresented groups within our education system. Many of our students are marginalized and vulnerable, and thus need for access and inclusion is dire. Intolerance, discrimination, and prejudice manifest in our schools in many ways. Therefore, the work of advocates is necessary and important. As an educator, research will be one of those ways in which you can lend your voice to advocacy and social justice work. There are many educators and social justice advocates working in many parts of the world, and in particular our Caribbean region, in areas such as exploitation of children, child workers, human trafficking, prostitution, right to free education, right to adequate health care, racial profiling, poverty and inequality, access to education, censorship of textbooks, rewriting history. Other areas include children with disabilities, language of instruction, impact of illiteracy on society, indigenous populations, globalization versus local ethnic identity, freedom of the press, globalization again versus local identity, that's a big one, inequality in world politics, hate speech. Do you know any organizations doing this kind of work or research? Who are the advocates? How do they do their work? What is the work looking like at this point? The place of research in the work of advocacy. Something to think about, something to examine. How discrimination against marginalized and underrepresented groups manifest in learning communities. We look at 4 ways: criminal offenses, playground or schoolyard behavior, school policies and practices, and stereotyping and other biases in curriculum, textbooks, and other media resources. Learning communities are microcosms of the wider society in which they exist. Therefore, as we already seen, stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination can be found at the individual, interpersonal, and structural level, impacting students, teachers, administrators, parents, and other stakeholders, both in overt and covert manifestations. There is a need for social justice in education. Consciously working at unmasking your own personal bias. Pay close attention to the impact on minorities and marginalized groups within the society and within your specific learning community. The need for educational leaders to play a role as social justice advocate on behalf of all these groups for the greater good of all. There is indeed a need for social justice advocacy in education. People sometimes have images of advocates as militant, parading down streets, chanting angry slogans, and being hauled away by the police. While this is one of the expressions of advocacy, it is not the only one, and frequently not the most effective. Advocacy does not necessarily involve confrontation or conflict. Advocacy is the active promotion of a cause or principle. It involves actions that lead to a specific goal. Advocacy generally involves getting government, businesses, schools, or large institutions to correct an unfair or harmful situation affecting people in the community. Advocates are diversity leaders. They are change agents, watchdogs, and policymakers. Again, we take a look at the educational leader as social justice advocate. What is your work? To educate, to advocate, to act. Look around you. Look around you. Where is the need for social justice? Where is the need for advocacy? What will you do as a diversity leader? What will you do as a change agent? Again, we take a step back for reflection. Again, we must self-examine our work, our part, our role in the work of advocacy and social justice. Yes, the educational leader is seen as the agent of change. Education leaders as agents of change. And we look at the right to quality education, free of discrimination, is a fundamental human right of every child, including those from minority and marginalized groups. Education leadership as a moral purpose, which is to transform the lives of students, their families, and the societies in which they live, including the global society. One of the moral purposes of education is to teach students democratic values and how to live as citizens in a democracy. In closing, here are a few questions. Are you ready for the work of an advocate? Who are the marginalized groups in your learning community? What are you going to do to ensure inclusion and access in your learning community.